Welcome to Popcorn Psychology, the podcast where we watch blockbuster movies and psychoanalyze them. My name is Brittany Brownfield, and I'm a child therapist, and I'm joined by...
Ben Stover, individual therapist.
Hannah Espinoza, marriage and family therapist.
We are all licensed clinical professional counselors, also known as therapists, who practice out of Chicago. Even though we are licensed mental health professionals, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes and to fulfill our love of dissecting pop culture in all forms.
Please remember that even though we are all licensed therapists, we aren't your therapist.
If you are struggling with mental health symptoms, please find a local mental health provider.
And welcome to a different episode of Popcorn Psychology. We're actually starting a series with the movie Sleep Talking. It's a movie in production right now with Jess Costa, who's writing and directing, and she's actually with us today as a guest. And so through this series, we're going to be following the creation of this movie. Right now, it is in the fundraising and pre-production stages, if I'm understanding that correctly. I don't know anything about film, so I assume that's correct terms. And we'll be, intermittently rejoining to talk about the process of making this movie Sleep Talking. So if you want to kind of introduce what this movie is, Jess?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for having me, by the way. It's such a treat. I've been following you all with your Scream and Practical Magic podcast, so I'm a big fan. So it's nice to be on the other side. But I'm making a movie, as you said. It's called Sleep Talking. It is a feature-length film. We're in the process now developing it to film this summer. And it is about Maya, who is a 12-year-old protective older sister who schemes to solve their family's decade-long mystery, only to discover that her sister's sleep talking may be more sinister than it seems. The film takes place in the 90s and starts off in the 1920s because, to add a little fun drama. And it's just really diving into their family dynamic and how they all process a loss, and how a mystery, and how an older sister goes about saving the world.
Cool. And so, because this is a movie that's still being made, obviously, audience, you will not have seen this movie yet. So we're going to be talking about the bit of the script that we have had the privilege to read. We've gotten about the first 30 some pages of the script so far, and it was really cool to read. I love horror movies, so this very much was something I would go see in the theaters. So it was definitely intriguing to read, and I'm interested to read more and figure out what happens. So today we're going to be talking about characters you haven't quite met yet, but we're going to be talking about generational trauma and the parentification within siblings. And then we're going to be talking about the artist process and kind of like the psychology of creating. So like you said, Jess, we do start in the 20s in this movie, and we kind of see a little girl. She's 5, correct?
Yes.
Josie. And she's kind of, if I'm understanding correctly, kind of the first generation of this set of siblings, where it seems like there's a loss within each generation.
Yeah, definitely. As you said, like the film starts off with a mother and her daughter, Josie, who is sick. And then we flash forward to Josie, who becomes great Aunt Josie, to the young girl, Maya, and her younger sister, Ellie, and whose mom, Lori, who has a sister, Sarah, who is Josie's nieces. And yes, I did have to draw out a family tree when writing this.
I bet. I think one of the things that I really liked, I'm really excited to hear more and read more of the script, because I really like the way the story is set up. And I really like the way that not only the interaction between Maya and Ellie, but also the kind of, I feel like we're kind of watching Maya's thoughts, like exactly the way that she's thinking out things and the way she's trying to figure everything out and what's happening. But I think we're supposed to be talking about generational trauma, and I just start talking about whatever.
No, definitely. It's I think it's the big part of generational trauma is how each generation in this family is trying to figure out what's going on. And I think we get to see that actively through each person throughout the story. So it's like Maya's like, what the hell is going on with my mom? Lori is trying to figure out what happened to her sister back in the 60s when she went missing. Aunt Josie is helping Lori through that process. And in some way, we don't see it as much in the film, but Josie figuring out who she is and how she is in this dynamic. So it's everyone figure out everything all the time, which I think we all are trying to as we live in life.
We are definitely all trying to figure that out. And I think what I like about the way I was reading this story is seeing the way when you start adding some other townspeople in where Maya's not familiar with this town, with these people where Aunt Josie lives, and seeing how other people interpret her family and other people react to her, and how people all know this story that she's not familiar with, and she's learning about what happened to her family from the standpoint of people who know more about it than she does. But it starts providing some context to why her mother is behaving the way she is. And so many family secrets start to be leaked out in a way that almost reminded me of It, and how when they were in the library and started trying to learn more about what happened in Derry.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. It's oh, go ahead.
I feel like a big part of having intergenerational trauma is that there are a lot of secrets, and there's a lot of protective behavior and or just like no one really saying anything, but everybody kind of knowing. And I feel like part of what we get in the beginning is the confusion of the 5-year-old, in terms of like even she doesn't really understand what is happening, and how it can be like that sometimes in a family. It can be like that in terms of being confused about why do the same things always happen when we're together? Why is there always this kind of hostility or uncomfortableness that we're all experiencing? Because there's a piece missing. There's so many different pieces missing, and only certain people have the pieces. And how, in terms of when we talk about trauma, because people have tried different ways to understand the trauma in their family, because that's one of the biggest parts of kind of managing our experience in the world, is by trying to understand where we came from and how those pieces fit into who we are, and do they make an impact and do they not make an impact. And I feel like when we have intergenerational trauma, there's a really big chance, if not always this happens, where some people have been so traumatized that they're unable to experience the memory of whatever it was, so even they don't have the answers.
Yeah, and with sleep talking, it's so much more of that. And even Josie isn't able to articulate what she's gone through and what she understands. And Lori, even Maya's mother who lost her sister, she hadn't articulated what she went through for years. Like right now we're seeing her finally process something that happened 34 years earlier. And so it's really that honestly, like, I really want to focus in on people dealing with trauma in a delayed sense as well, and then how that also affects each generation. So like if you don't deal with it right off the bat, get therapy, just even talk to it about anyone, how does that affect the generations after you? How does that affect your whole family dynamic, which is a big heart and center of sleep talking?
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. That is such an important component of trauma work in general, and anything that's going to draw attention to that is speaking my language, because this is what I sit in all day, every day. Is like the past 6 years or so, my focus has really switched from focusing on specializing in mood disorder treatment to trauma, because realizing that even in graduate school, at least the Illinois curriculum, that's the word I'm looking for, that left my head for a minute, is that in the Illinois curriculum, even taking trauma classes for therapists is an elective, which makes no sense to me at all, because it's always trauma. And like you're describing with your film and trying to illustrate, is that the messaging that gets passed down through a family about how the world is interpreted is always going to be based on the pain that was experienced by the generations before you, and how they are teaching the generations after them to avoid that pain and avoid repeating that same thing. But often that's done through keeping of secrets and of not telling whole truths, but then installing behaviors and anecdotes and interpretations that don't necessarily make any sense to the current generation. And that delay in processing that happens because people are so often taught, well, just avoid it. Don't think about it. Push it down. Don't deal with it. And it's not real anymore. But yet we still do all of these things to prevent ourselves from feeling or dealing with it, and how that becomes insidious into the DNA of a family.
Definitely. And it's also, I think, on another side of it too, it's not just like hiding it for the sake of not wanting to talk about it, but wanting to make everything seem okay and normal and safe, especially when there's younger ones involved, especially when there's someone who's 12 or 5, from the mindset of like, oh, they don't understand it yet, where kids understand it so much more than we realize, because it's just like implicitly in their life every day, even just the small little tokens, as you said, like throwing it up, being like, oh, don't do that. Let's stay home. Actually, you're not allowed to walk by yourself. Why? Just because I said so.
Yeah, exactly. Taking kids' understanding completely for granted. And also that the idea that kids don't inherently already know that something is going on, or that something doesn't feel quite right, and that they will absorb that. And one of the things that we've definitely talked about on the podcast multiple times is, who do you want to explain things to your kid? Because if you want it to be somebody else, or they're going to make their own story that, depending on the age that they are, could be scarier, could be much worse than what's actually going on, because they're, in terms of developmentally, they can't make abstract thought at those ages. And so they might end up making a more fantastical way to be able to understand something, which then can create a whole other set of struggles for that person, in terms of, well, this is what trying to, again, piece together. Well, this is what it felt like when I was a kid. Why do I have problems with relationships now? Or why do I feel like I always have to be in control? And seeing that, and I think the other piece that's really interesting too is Lori's anxiety, and how she's so anxious all the time, which in this setting, in terms of all of a sudden finding out more information about her sister's disappearance, makes sense. And at the same time is also clearly something that she always has, based on the fact that Maya is able to pick that up and can kind of put something into motion immediately.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's, I think, Maya trying to deal with her mom's reaction, and also trying to understand quickly, one, like, how do I make the situation better? Like, exactly what you said. And like, one of the biggest themes of me writing this script was Maya having to learn that if she tries to control, fix, save everyone, she may lose herself in the process. And I also just wanted to talk about how, even when we're 12, that we know so much more than we realize, and that we actually sometimes have to step up and be the parent already at that age. And I feel like people are like, oh no, like, kids, yes, they know more than they think, but they're not like fully grown, and they can't help us fix things and want to try to help and save. And we're like, oh yeah, we do. Like, everyone did. They were like, yeah, I'm an adult now. I'm a preteen. I could fix this. We got this, Mom.
My daughter does that at 3. She's 3 years old, and she, if something's wrong with me, she knows. Or if I'm hurt or frustrated or angry or whatever, she'll know. And sometimes she'll come up and she'll try to fix things. And they know, and definitely by 12 they know. And I think in the script, so the bits of it that we've seen so far, something I'm very excited to see explored is what I don't know yet, and the audience doesn't know yet, I'm sure, and maybe you don't know yet either, depending on where you're at with writing it, is how Dad factors into this story, and the relationship between Maya and Dad, and what Mom and Dad have not told Maya about the story and about Mom's psychology that Dad knows and is reacting to, because some of the behaviors I've seeing him display are like, Dad knows something and he is not telling Maya, and he is anxious for probably really good reasons that are probably a big family secret that's going to blow up
Well, and I felt like even I was also thinking about it in terms of his dad been more of a primary caregiver as well, because mom has been so wrapped up in trying to solve this puzzle of her life that she hasn't been able to give the kind of leadership sounds like such a dumb word, but for some reason I can't fucking think of anything. Leadership of being like a parent, like clearly that dynamic is fucked. Like that dynamic is not a thing, right? So even dad's response to he clearly knows something, right? And two, he could also just really like I think any father would miss their children, but he also could really miss them because he is the one who normally is taking care of them all the time. And I think he's asking some very reasonable things in the script.
Yeah, definitely. It's the whole dynamic of where we're actually at in the script. The script is actually locked, which means that all the scenes are actually going to stay the same. Basically, in the process, like the dialogue's going to change, just as we like get to play with it with actors, and they actually say the words, and you're like, that sounds disgusting. But yeah, dad is definitely I think he has that big internal struggle of like, I know what Lori has gone through and how she has numbed herself, and now it's going to this very like obsessive research hole, and also wanting to try to trust his daughter. And so know that when she says she's not okay, be like, okay, I believe you. And then maybe even later, he's like, wait a second, she's a kid. Like, I'm her dad. And it's balancing that act of like, I want to trust you when you say that things are all right, but also the parent line steps in at that place.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think it's just, like we've already said so far, it's just in the practice of treating someone like Maya or even Lori, you can't just treat what you're seeing. You have to go back in the family tree and see how we got here. Because even if dad is just out of the picture right now, we're about to slide into this, but Maya's already parentified to a point where this has been going on for a minute. You don't get to this point as a kid with your personality. Like, there's so many things I highlighted where I was like, a 12-year-old shouldn't say that, or a 12-year-old shouldn't think that, or a 12-year-old shouldn't worry about that. Even me as an oldest child, I wouldn't have thought that, because though I was an oldest child, I wasn't parentified by my parents. And so if you work with a kid like Maya, you can't just be like, well, that's just adult business, stay out of adult business. And like, you have to think, that's why when people say you have to be very conscious of systemic situations as well, because generational trauma happens for a lot of reasons. You know, in this story particularly, it's just repeated trauma, which happens all the time with different generations, because as human beings, we love to live within patterns. But then in systemic trauma and generational trauma, with like, racial trauma and misogyny, and like you have to take all that into context and how that trickles down into the family dynamic, causing anxiety where there wouldn't necessarily be anxiety for someone else. And you do have to be mindful of how that presents. Like, is this child naturally anxious, or were they raised by an anxious parent who was raised by an anxious parent? And then you have to think about how the environment shapes that.
And so as a person who was a parentified child, a lot of the things that Maya was saying made a lot of sense to me in terms of feeling like they can control anything, feeling like they're allowed to take the first step, feeling like they're the ones who are allowed to make decisions about things. Her automatic response to take care of her sister, that is, not necessarily completely unnatural, but pretty fucking unnatural in terms of the weight that it puts on her about taking care of her sister, versus other people might be like, oh, she's just a really good sister. It's like, no, she thinks that her sister's life is literally in her hands. That's the difference between being an oldest and being a parentified child. And I remember the first time I saw that word in grad school and being like, oh no, I know what that means.
Oh, it's always the worst when you read the term that describes your life in 2 sentences or less, and you go like,
I was like, oh no. Oh no.
Yep.
But a lot of the way, even some of the, again, adult language that she uses in terms of things, or knowing kind of always having her own plan, and how a parentified child always has their own plan. In case the shit hits the fan, they always know, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I would do if mom did this. This is what I would do if dad did this. It's kind of this constant, again, the constant sense of anxiety for the child that I think ends up starting to feel just natural and normal, because it's just something that you always have, you're always holding on to, and you're always it's like a different way. Maybe it's not a different way, but it's almost a different way of being hypervigilant.
It is being hypervigilant.
Yeah.
It's the Truman Show has a quote that's like, we accept the life that we're presented. And so, like, for Maya, it's very much that, like, she acts this way and steps up this way purely because this is the world she knows. Her mom may bow out in a moment. At the beginning of the script, the mom's like, you have to watch Ellie. I'll be right back for a day. You're like, wait a minute, what? And dad's on a work call. And so I'm like, okay, this is my leverage. I'm going to tell you that you have to take us or I'll call dad.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And even that too, feeling like you're at the same level as your parents in terms of interjecting yourself within their conflict, thinking that you can just step in and dictate how they are interacting with each other, is also being a parentified child.
Well, and even shifting the power dynamic to be higher than one of the other, because one of them is behaving in a way that is not normal, not safe, and not okay. And you're like, oh, mom's not well right now, so now I have to step up and assume a position in the family hierarchy that is higher than a parent. And that is a recipe for a lot of trouble.
And then the confusion that a kid has when a parent wants you to act like a parent when it is helpful for them. But as soon as you do it in front of them, they then yell at you about it. Because even I think one of the things in the script I think I've heard before, you're not the parent. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not the parent right now. But in 20 minutes, when you're out being weird on the fucking porch, I got to figure out what to do with these kids and whether or not they fucking ate. So you know what? So it's so
unfair.
Yeah. Well, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. And then the kid, it becomes the slippery slope of it. The parent in that system will then start to recognize that they can defer some of their responsibility onto the child. And I saw dad doing that in this, where, well, tell your mom to call me, or instead of going, go get your mother.
Yes,
have mom call
I thought
me.
the same thing.
Me and Brittany talked about that.
And seeking information from a child, right? Like, hold on. Like, you are trying to glean information from a child as opposed to gather information from your spouse. And that changes the way the entire family system functions, because now the child is having to pick sides and align themselves with one parent or the other. And also the parent is finding that, oh, well, this was easier this time, so maybe I can do that. Maybe I can defer some responsibility onto her, or maybe I can pick up this extra shift and the kid will take care of the sister. And we can do this. Yeah, they'll be fine. And that starts to happen more often. And then you see the parentification take hold, and the child loses part of their childhood and becomes caregiver and loses some of their identity in the family as a peer and becomes a boss. It's like that process of when you're at a job and you take a leadership position, and the people who were your work friends are no longer your work friends, they're your staff. And the dynamic gets weird for a little while.
Mm-hmm. And it's also with Maya, since she's 12 and still figuring it out. I wanted to play with the fact that she might not know the ramifications of what she's doing and how she's like stepping up and making all the calls, but she's like, I'm just doing the immediate factor and just fixing it for now, and like putting the Band-Aid over the Band-Aid on top of just a bigger Band-Aid rather than being like, oh, well, this might just unravel and fall apart later.
Right. Because a 12-year-old doesn't have the brain capacity to understand the game they are not playing. Yeah. They don't understand the game within the game.
Yeah, because you're treated like you're grown, you're treated like you're older than you are. And so you start to believe that, obviously. And then you miss the obvious blind spots of being 12 because, yeah, just because you think you're an adult. And also, like, looping back to the generational trauma thing, I know we don't know yet, or I don't know yet about her mom and the sister that went missing. But if that was also a role that they were in, like where the generational trauma has to be empathize with when you work with a family like this is, was mom treated this way as a kid, and therefore she didn't know that she was asking something of her child that is inappropriate and unfair. Like, because there are a lot of, like, this is more of an old school approach, but I'm from a Catholic background. You know, there's a lot of things. You have big families, the oldest kids raise the youngest, and that's just understood. And no one, I think we're just now starting to recognize culturally how deeply inappropriate and unfair that is, to have the oldest kids take care of the youngest kids. And that's still something people still believe and do. And it's part of being in a quote unquote big family, is taking on that role as an oldest child and having too much responsibility over the well-being of your younger siblings.
Yeah, to answer your question, a lot of what I was writing Lori's background is that, so Lori's the younger sister and her older sister Sarah went missing, and her parents actually didn't let her help and almost made her feel powerless. And so as a response, Lori actually treats Maya as an adult to some respect, because she felt like she was so belittled and that she felt like she wasn't even allowed to even help to the slightest ability. So now that she's an adult, she can step in and help with Sarah. She can step forward. She's like, Maya, you can have power too. You, like, I want to trust you as an adult. But then it, like, when you try to do the balancing scale, when does it tip too much?
Yeah, I definitely see that all the time as a family therapist, in terms of, I don't want to be like my parents, so I'm too empathetic, or I'm too loose with my boundaries, or even too firm. You're right, because I think we struggle so much to not go too far in the pendulum shift when we are trying to do something different than what we knew before.
Well, and also because it was never modeled. So we're also, you know, again, another situation where somebody is trying to put the fucking pieces together and be like, how would an adult with children do this? And because we don't have a model for it, not that we can't learn or anything like that, but just because we haven't ever seen it before, it can be hard to imagine what it would be like in that moment when you're actually having those kinds of interactions with your children. And so in some ways, it would make sense for people to go to therapy at that time and see if they could get some help and support with that. But I just know that that's almost always a big piece. And I feel like as family therapists, it's something we see a lot in terms of, well, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't like my parents. It's like, okay, but also we got to do something here. Like, they are still only this age. What were you like when you were 15? And then they're like, oh no. I'm like, yeah, we're not having to talk about that.
Yep. And I think something that stands out to me, even as we think about that, is, you know, when Jess, you're describing mom, like the central conflict that she's going to run into, even though, you know, like, I don't know her that well yet from where we're at in this process, is that what I can already guarantee, and I'm sure you as the writer have already factored this in, because writing is clearly in touch with what trauma is and how it works and how it impacts this family, which is going to make for a great film. So if you guys are listening to us, be sure to keep your eyes peeled for when this comes out, because it looks awesome.
Yeah, we're super pumped. We're super pumped. Me and Brittany were like, I want to know more about what's going to happen right after we read it. Anyway, go ahead, Ben.
I'm sorry. I'm real picky with horror films, and this one piques my interest. And so...
Thank you.
That's good. Yeah, I'm real. I'm like, Brittany and Hannah are like, did you watch this one? I'm like, no. But this is the kind of thing that gets my attention. And why is because when mom didn't get to help when her sister disappeared, her mom didn't let her help. That is going to create what we call in EMDR therapy a script that runs her show. And what's going to have prevented her from processing this from 30 years ago is that idea that I am powerless, or I am useless, or I couldn't help. There was nothing that I can do. There's nothing that I can do. And then she's going to have that trauma is going to be blocked by that thought, because that thought will create shame, which will not let her sit in the emotional activation of the feeling she needs long enough to process it. And therefore the brain will keep resending the signal of that over and over, and always run into that shame and guilt wall of, I didn't do anything. And depending on which way she interpreted that, whether she's helpless, useless, prevented from power, whatever it is, that will block her from ever being able to fully process it, let it go, and move on from it, and is going to replay itself in the way that she parents and the way that she raises her family and protects herself.
Yeah, and each character through this deals with like a central theme of control, and like, can I control the situation? Was I allowed to have any control or say? And throughout the film, as we're talking about the whole family dynamic, but there's also a whole supernatural moth lore throughout the film, and the whole symbolic nature of a moth to a flame. Can a moth actually control going to the flame or not? And can it be over consuming? And so it's mom goes through it the whole time. She's like, I couldn't control this, so now I'm going to control everything. And then Maya's like, oh, my mom's out of control. I need to control this. And it's like, dad's like, the whole family's out of control. I need to control this and show up. And Maya's like, no, but I'm in control.
Right. And the crazy thing about that, and you know what you see in that dynamic when it represents itself in real life, and seems like in this story, is that when mom gets into that mode, that memory of when her sister was lost is triggered. That script that runs her show is being told and interpreted from the version of her that was a teenager when her sister, or a child, I don't remember the age, when her child.
Well, her sister was a teenager.
Right, when her sister left. So her mindset is that of a child. And it's that frozen memory and that runs that script that determines how her behavior goes in the future. That memory hasn't linked up with her adult mind that knows how to survive adult situations. So the only file she references at that time is her childhood mind, which forces Maya to reckon with, oh, I'm dealing with a peer, not my mom.
And I also find it very funny that it's called Run It Script. So as just a filmmaker background, I'm just like, oh, hey.
Right. I use movies as like metaphors for understanding this so many times, because in the trauma therapy I do, well, one of them, EMDR, there's 3 different variants of it that you can do. And the way we describe it is frame, scene, film. So that you're either working on desensitizing someone to the most disturbing frame, or you run the scene, or you work how the whole thing connects. And learning how and when to apply that is really powerful, because different people are ready for different things at different times.
Mm-hmm. And how even narrative therapy is similar in terms of helping someone rewrite their story and or look at it from a different point of view versus the one who's, you know, in the front, who's the first person speaking. That also helps with helping people manage their trauma as well.
And so does psychodrama, which was largely developed and performed in New York. With psychodrama, which is just such a fascinating modality of therapy, where you actually have people get into an improv theater and pick the person in the group that most reminds you of the antagonist of your scene, and it forces the people to then act out the scene, and then the director will have them switch parts. Well, they'll play the part of their antagonist, and they'll have them replay it and operate it in a way that they would have wanted to see it. And you see all of these opportunities to use art to rewrite these scripts and rehearse them and act within them in ways that help you find an adaptive response that connect your past to, and the frozen version of yourself that exists in that, to the present version that has skills to manage that differently.
Yeah, and it's so true. It's like using art as a medium in order to process trauma, and in order to, I would say, like, either rewrite our own stories or just to even process what's going on in our lives, which is honestly how I got into film and how I got into writing in general. Just as I was a 14-year-old who lost her dad and I couldn't understand it. And so like I was able to express myself through writing before, or just through visuals before I could even articulate how I was feeling through words. And so like that's a lot of, for me, it's like, oh yeah, how can I use art and to understand what's going on in life? How can I use art to pick apart these visuals that like, if I start writing something like, I don't actually know what's going on in the scene. Let's pick it apart and actually have like zoom out and say like, what is this? What's going on here? What's coming out subconsciously that I didn't realize I need to work out with until right now. And that's the beauty of art.
It is. And even more so is that you can take whatever you've been through and have an opportunity to, as you work through that, you've just also created a beautiful opportunity for someone else who may be going through something similar to access a different way to let their mind process it. And you will probably get a lot of people who will write you and send you messages on social media or emails to let you know that your art touched them in that way.
Which means so much more than you realize. It's my life goal is to help that way.
And I would say too, sorry to cut you off, Jess. What I was really impressed with in the writing was the subtle ways in which you showed that Maya is like anxious and parentified and trying to like not just be a kid that's been put in that role by their parents, but also I know we don't know that much yet about her mom, but also feels like a kid who has a parent who might not be mentally stable. I think that's also part of it too, is I have to, like you were saying, control the situation because I can't trust my caregiver to control the situation, especially if my dad is going on trips or if he travels for work. And I think there were really subtle ways that you demonstrated that I highlighted as a therapist that I don't know if someone else would have, like the fact that Maya takes her sister out of her car seat and and is conscious of bedtime. And those are all attributes that anyone else could say, oh, what a conscientious child, what a helpful sister. And they're more subtle where I was like, why? It wouldn't, like I said, I was an oldest child, would never have occurred to me to take my sibling out of a car seat. I was always like out of that car and like doing my own thing. And so I thought those were really good, subtle clues to what her role was like that I think other people might witness as well and be like, oh, maybe all that stuff I used to do that I used to take a lot of pride in, maybe I need to recontextualize that.
Definitely. And it's a lot of, I think as we get older too, looking back at like those little subtle things that we start to do or we do so naturally, like for example, in my own life, like the simple thing of like, oh, anytime I go somewhere, I have to bring something. And it's like, is that because of like, was it because I was shown this? Is it from praise? And we're like, oh, you get praised every time you bring something. You're like, oh, you're so thoughtful and conscientious. Thank you so much. And it's just like the little subtle things that you start inheriting, A, from your family, and B, then you're like, oh, why do I do this thing? Which is, I think for me, the fun and hilarious side of like psychology and looking at myself, I'm like, oh, humans are fun that way.
Yeah. It's always such a hard when you have to look at yourself and be like, am I doing this because it's true to me? Or am I doing this because I think if I don't do this, everyone will hate me or everyone will leave me? Or, I mean, it's such a hard thing you always have, like you have to do in therapy, like really look at yourself, your inner eye kind of towards yourself and be like, oh, like what is the driving factor to this behavior? And is it not that great? And it's really hard to acknowledge that when it's a behavior like with Maya that probably gets a lot of praise. I'm sure she gets told all the time, oh my God, you're such a thoughtful child. You're so precocious. You're so ba 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 ba. And as a kid, like, of course, you're going to associate that with positivity and that you're doing the right thing because so many adults who might not know the whole story and your people who do know the whole story give you so much praise. You're so strong, you're so thoughtful. And yeah, and it's so, it's just so easy how that it's such a slippery slope.
Yeah, and especially as like the older sibling for Maya, it's a lot of like, oh, I'm doing what's good. And it's like, my mom needs help. Great, I'll step in. And it's not realizing, like she doesn't have the wherewithal to then zoom out and be like, but why am I doing this? It's just like, this feels good. Great, next.
Mm-hmm. And also with such a big age difference between siblings. like whenever they say whenever there's more than a 5-year age difference, you're basically only children, in terms of like birth order psychology, if you believe in that. And so also in this dynamic, it sounds like all the generations of this family so far where there is that big enough age difference where it's really easy to take care of the younger sibling.
Yeah, everyone in this family dynamic, the way it all worked out is my family tree again. So great Aunt Josie, she had an older sister, Betty, who was 16 years older than her, and she was at boarding school. So she didn't realize that everything that was going on in their family, that like her parents died and that her younger sister was left by herself. And then we fast forward then Betty has 2 kids, who is Lori, Maya's mom, and Sarah, who disappeared. And they're about 4 years apart. And then Maya and Ellie, our main character, Maya is 12 and Ellie is 5. So then there's that 7-year, and especially being that preteen, like, I'm an adult, and Ellie being like, I'm just happy to do arts and crafts and make a fort, is 2 different mindsets altogether.
And I think, and that actually reminds me of something else I was thinking while reading the script was, my assumption is that Maya is now the same age that Lori was when her sister disappeared, or around the same age. And that also, bringing it back to generational trauma, that can be really hard. Like for a parent, when their child is the age that they were when they went through whatever they went through, that in itself can be traumatizing, or just can bring up a lot of stuff that maybe they didn't think was going to be there. Like, oh, I'm over this thing. And then you see your child and it reminds you of how you felt at that age. And it can bring up all these feelings. And though it seems like there's external stuff going on that triggers this for Lori, I wonder if she was already sort of feeling that by seeing Maya be her age when she lost her sister.
Yep, which definitely sounds a lot like the stuff that we covered in our practical magic episode. So if you haven't checked that out, this is a good opportunity to do so, because it connects very much to this idea that Brittany's talking about here of seeing the way that traumas replay, and when state-dependent memories start to kick in and a child starts to look like you did when you went through that, and then all of a sudden you feel what you felt and are acutely aware of their age and what they might be going through, especially if they repeat your story.
Yeah, when I listened to the Practical Magic episode, I was like, oh, this is what's going on in my script too. Hello. I was like, light bulb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when we talked about the practical magic, which might also be going on in this story, is that when one sibling is really hyper responsible and hyper vigilant and conscientious, it allows the other sibling to be a bit more free and like light, and that's how that's what we talked about in that movie with Sandra Bullock's character, Nicole Kidman. Like, that's how siblings with the same background can become so different personality wise, is because if one sibling takes more responsibility, the other sibling can then kind of relax, or kind of, they just don't have that responsibility, so they can kind of process things differently. And so you see that with Ellie, though she's 5, so she's obviously very little. Yeah. She's a lot more carefree than Maya.
Yeah, and Ellie a lot in this script. Oops, sorry, my dogs.
That's okay. Hannah's cats like screech in our episodes.
And my child yells.
So they bang on the bedroom door.
I was going to say, they don't fucking screech. They're not maniacs. They just make noise sometimes.
But, yeah, and Ellie in this as well, because I think her as a person is a little more naturally in her own world and dreamy and just is spinning around and singing at every moment. Maya also sees that and wants to protect it at the same time. So it's not just the opportunity for them to be vastly different, but Maya being so actively aware of, like, I need to protect this child who's already in her own little bubble, and let's not pop that.
And so often we will see the parentified child take on the burden of protecting the younger one from anything and everything, but in particular, whatever bad things they're aware of. They will really make that their mission.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to get across in this film as well, like Maya, who's like, I'm the adult, everything's logical and practical, and I'm going to make everything okay, is that she has these like childish nightmares that then bring her back into the fantasy and back into like actual child nightmares of like a sheep crawling down and choking someone, which, you know, is the fun, horrific life of a horror movie. Yeah. But yeah, just her processing, or her subconscious not processing and being like, I'm in control. Everything's practical. It's like, oh no, it's not.
There's a concept in DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, called wise mind that I use all the time. And it's this idea that there's a Venn diagram, and one circle is your emotion mind. So like your thoughts, your feelings, your symptoms, your desires. And then there's your logic mind, which is like your shoulds. I should behave. I need to go to school. I got to go to work. I got to take care of business. And the way we think about it is those two minds have to link. You can't just be completely in your emotion mind or your logic mind, because one will pop. And like you're saying with Maya, she's trying to be just in her logic mind, and that's popping.
And it always does. It always does. A fascinating thing to watch of the number of people, especially men, but people in general, who try to logic their way out of feelings, and you can't. You just can't. One area of the brain's functioning will inhibit the other when one is hyperactivated. And when your brain interprets threat, the functions of the anterior cingulate cortex will inhibit the functions of the neofrontal cortex, which is where your ability to rationally process things lives. It's why when somebody is really upset, no matter how many times you tell them, it didn't happen like that, or that's not what happened, that's not how it's going, or you're safe now, he's not here, they're not here. They can't hear that because their brain is still in hyperdrive hijack mode, interpreting threat, and it's operating at a primal level. And it's just not possible to respond to emotions with logic. And people try it over and over despite knowing that, because feelings are bad. We shouldn't have them. But yet they're a neurochemical impulse that exists within our body that is no different than the one that tells you have to pee. And when you try to fight that one of two things happen. You decide the appropriate receptacle for it, or you pee your pants. And I really think that's the same thing that happens with emotional outbursts. Is you either find the appropriate receptacle and talk about or deal with whatever's going on appropriately, or it bursts out of you at a time in a manner that you did not expect, from a version of yourself you did not expect to emerge at that time. Like, why does your childlike anger erupt at something that is sensitive every time? Because that access to script that is running your show that you didn't realize, and because you did not find the appropriate receptacle for that, boom, out it goes. And then it's up to your body. Right, you peed yourself. And that could be the new hashtag when, you're you realize that you did it again. Like, hashtag I peed myself emotionally.
Well, the emotional pee.
I don't see that actually becoming a thing, but
if
it does, I'm copywriting that. You emotionally peed yourself. That's not a thing. I'll see myself out.
It'll become an actual study in 100 years. Like, and then there's a study of the emotional pee.
Right.
Absolutely.
So you kind of already started talking about it, Jess, but in terms of like the artist process and like the psychology of creating, I have a question, but if it's too emotional or sensitive, you can disregard it. But I guess in using art to process, does anything ever come up where you have to like walk away from what you're creating?
Oh, definitely. There was a version of this script that I was even playing with as well, because as I mentioned, my dad passed away. He had bipolar depression and took his own life. And it's like a lot of Laurie's character having that manic behavior comes from that as well. And there was a whole part of it where is it like, oh, are we going to really focus in even more on Laurie and how Maya processes her mother's manic behavior and how that maybe might cycle into the end of the script? And I remember looking at my producer, Danielle, and I was like, I can't write that version. Like, that's just not going to happen. I don't want to be making this for 2 years, because that's also the big thing. It's like, yes, there's one part where I'm like, do I need to like bare my soul this much and then go through pain for 2 years? Because there's the line of like, well, someone will learn something for that. I'm like, I can make a different version of the script that someone will resonate with as well. So there was definitely that dynamic where I had to really sit down and be like, Danielle, can I do this? And Faye was like, that's up for you to decide. You don't seem like you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's recognizing where your own boundaries are of like, how deep do I want my soul to bear into this? And can't.
Yeah, and there's like a lot of the stuff I've been working on is like vulnerability and trying to be very honest and open and sharing, but then there's like, what are the safety lines? Like, what do I need to feel safe in being vulnerable? And it's like, I love sharing my story and hoping that someone can hear it and just feel heard and understood, because I wasn't aware that my dad had bipolar growing up. So like, that's also why like a lot of the mystery elements are in this script, because I wasn't aware. And then it was like, oh, bam. So for me, I'm like, I will talk about it all day in a very obviously like sensitive and being emotionally aware version of it. And there's other sides who are like, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty details. And I'm not going to then show that stuff on screen because that would be heartbreaking. Some people do that as a way of catharsis though, and like to each their own. But like, it's definitely like learning, as we do every day of our life, like what are our emotional boundaries? It's like, what is that with my work? And like, do I want to be watching this 2 years later and be like, actually, I think I was trying to do that to prove that I could. And that's when I was like, I don't want to do that. I want to have a script that I want to rewatch. And that's the fun of it.
That has to be an interesting challenge to make, to like figure out how you separate out what is your story and what is your character story.
Yeah, there comes to a line where like when you start writing a character that's very similar to yourself in a lot of ways, they end up actually becoming very boring characters at first, because you're like, oh yeah, I know how that person thinks and acts. And you're like, okay, put it in the script. And then, so then you need to start actually parsing out like, you know, the 100 questions you used to do with your friends back in the day, like, what's your favorite ice cream flavor? And like, you do that with your characters sometimes, where you're like, oh, well, how is Maya different than me? How is Ellie different than me? And really parsing it out, where like almost every character in the script has a little bit of me in it, but then it's like, how is Maya more like my sister? And how she was very parentified and went across that way. Or how is Lori different than myself, who dives into her work and then really focuses in to distract from life at times? And finding little ways to parse through. It's like, can we push it to the extremes? And that's what helps it. Is it really diving into like, okay, well, what would this character do in this moment, and letting them kind of walk and talk and do their own thing? It's like, that's for me at least, my process of like making it different from me versus their own characters with their own lives.
And I also imagine that makes it easier than like in the movie making process of it. Like eventually someone's going to play this character, and so this character also has to be part of them in terms of like how they're acting it. And I would imagine if you're too connected to it, of like, no, I know who exactly this person is because they're me, it would be hard to give the actor then the liberty to kind of make this character their own as well. Like if you're feeling too possessive of it.
Oh, definitely. And I think that's like with art in general, like there, it needs to be that conversation rather than like, it needs to be exactly like this. You're like, it's never going to be exactly like you imagined it. And I think that's the best part of film, where like, I'll write it and imagine it, and then we'll get on set and I'll be with actors and they're like, actually, like this doesn't feel right in this moment. And you talk about, you're like, okay, what would you do in this moment? What does feel right? And then we alter it and we adjust, and then we go from, it's like, and we edit it, which in editing, we always say is the third time rewriting the script. And so I think it's just allowing yourself to be flexible, allowing that collaboration and coming up with someone, be like, hey, like, how do you resonate with this? Like, I wrote it this way and this was the intention. And like the intention of the scene is this. Like as the director, it's always like making sure the heart of the moment is still there, but being able to help the actor get there with what they need.
That's got to be a really powerful experience to give someone access to your story, your soul, and then turn over the creation to them to bring it to actual life and negotiate that balance of what you saw versus what they did, and how you create that so that it feels like collaborative experience. It's positive for everyone.
Yeah, for me, it's one, I don't act because that scares the shit out of me. Like, I admire actors, and so much, so deeply, because I'm like, I can tell you this vulnerable thing and I can write this vulnerable thing. Now, please, you go act the vulnerable thing. I'll be back here with my coffee, third one of the day. And now you start crying. I'm really bearing your soul in this moment. And so I think that's where that moment happens, where I'm like, here you go. It's your time.
Yeah, it's when I don't really act anymore, but I have in the past, and never did the professional level, definitely the community theater, college kind of thing. So, not quite approximated to what professionals do, but having like been in those moments with directors, it's so interesting to find that balance of like, how do I access what I need to feel this and show you what you're trying to get me to, without having your story that you wrote and envisioned to create this and have such a firm grasp on that we share enough that I can produce that for you. And now I have to do it in a way that makes sense to me, and then makes sense for the character, and then makes sense for the writing. And like trying to honor all of that it's a really powerful experience. And it's so interesting to find those moments where that all really just clicks, and then sometimes takes a different direction than you thought it was, but then you find that it's so much better than you ever could have imagined it being.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of art. It's going to show up in natural little grains of a way, and you're like, actually, I'm glad we felt that out. And that's why I love rehearsals too, where you can really play it out and adjust. And also, one of my things as a director is like helping an actor get to that point, but also helping an actor make sure like we can walk away from it at the end of the day. Because I remember working on a film I was directing called Dreamland, and it was like a couple breaking up, and she was like, I felt drained every day afterwards. And I'm like, okay, now after doing more training, I've done some intimacy coordinating training as well. And one of the things they have taught is when actors are even doing intimate scenes, you actually have them like high five right before they get in scene. They're like, we're going to be intimate, we're acting. And they high five when they get out. So like, okay, the scene is over. We're not being intimate anymore. Or we're not being emotional anymore. If it's like a really emotionally power scene, like we're still good. We're colleagues, we're friends. Like, and here's a like emotional line. And they do that also with like a sexual line as well. Be like, our job's done right now. We're okay. We're safe and we're good, which I really love.
I love hearing that because, and it's definitely like the psychology of creation of even like intimacy or even like sexual relationships. It's like, I think we don't think enough at period about like aftercare, whatever that means, whatever context that is, and how that important that is to sustain a relationship. Like if you want to work with someone and then ruin them and then leave them behind, like that's your thing. And if you want to have something sustainable and positive, like you do have to have that aftercare. So it's so interesting to hear that in the context of filmmaking. Because I've only heard it in the context of like relationships.
Yeah, I know. My brain just lost his name. Acted in the Truman Show. I'm on the Truman Show kick today, apparently.
Jim Carrey?
Thank you. Jim Carrey. He talked about being in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and in the Andy Kaufman documentary. And the director went up to him and was like, oh, you just went through a breakup? Yeah, stay broken for a year. Stay heartbroken. I'll let you know when the script is done and we're going to make that. And he's like, so I stayed heartbroken for a year and then we shot it. I'm like, no, that's wackadoodle. I'm not going to like, and that's so much process and what but I would never do that. For me, I want people to go home and still feel good about themselves after they leave set. There's a line where it's like, it's not worth it for me.
And it reminds me of when you were talking about like sometimes you have to walk away from things too, and the process is like maybe you can sustain that level of whatever for however long you need it, but the burnout must be unreal. And like even like you were saying, which I didn't think about, when I have to decide what subject matter to tackle, I have to think about this in the context of, can I stand this for 2 years? And I think that's such a thoughtful way to, to go about it, is like, this isn't just writing a good product. It's like, can I sustain this story and being enmeshed with this story for however long it takes to not just like create it, develop it, shoot it, promo it, and like all the like that whole like all the way through is such a mindful way to go about it. So that's interesting.
Because you could also, if you want to just like get it out of your body, like write it and throw it in a drawer or burn it or whatever. Like I think it's the line of like, when do you choose something that you wrote, that you're going to actually produce and put out into the world and share it and work on it and be proud of it at the end. Because like I've written things where I'm like, so great, I got that out of my body, I'm done. Like obviously we're never done with it, but I got to process this now, and it's what I needed in this moment to move on for today. That's why I'm an active journaler. I have like journals everywhere. So it's like, I put it down on paper, I'm done for that. But like with this story of learning that like I can't control and save everybody, I'm like, that was such an important story to me, and I wanted to find a way that was manageable for me and exciting and fun and energizing to tell, that was also helpful and can help myself and others in the process.
It's
the question again of like, who is this for? Sorry, Brent.
Oh no, it's okay. Yeah, just it's powerful to find that, and like being able to understand too of like, what is something that I'm ready to share with the world, and what is something I needed to share with me, or just I needed to process. Because I know, like, I'm a musician and I've recorded music, and there's one song that I wrote. The first song that I wrote, I'd just gone through a real bad breakup that ended up fucking me up for a while, and it was a beautiful guitar part, but I don't play it ever anymore, because like I understand that feeling you're talking about of like, this could be I could write this song and I could actually record it and play it again, but I don't want to, because I don't want to relive that. I don't want to go back to that. And knowing where that line is in creating your art can really dictate where you're comfortable going. And like you're saying, with creating that boundary for yourself of, do I want to watch this again in 2 years, or am I going to be like, oh nope, that was more than I want to present over and over again to the world. And hopefully this finds great success in you guys as you go through it, or you end up on these late night shows talking about it and going like, sitting with Jimmy Fallon and like, man, the last thing I can see wanting to do is like, so that part was my deepest, worst personal fear, my worst personal hurt, and let's talk about that on national TV, please.
Yeah, and it's so much. It's like as we were saying before, it's like, who is this for? And like, for me, art is both for myself and for others to watch and process. And like, when it's so deeply just for me to go through, then it's like, I don't know if this, like, I feel safe in that moment. And like, I talk about sleep talking, this story needing to be my first feature, because it is like a cathartic purge in a way. Like, it's going through my family dynamics and going through just like processing myself. Like I did through COVID, I did a lot of inner child work as well. I did coaching because like, since we were hanging out, why not just work on myself? And like, a lot of the script has some of the inner child of like learning I can't control or fix and save everyone. And I'm like, I needed to tell this story and get this out and share so that I could write. Like some of the next scripts I have are like sci-fi films, and are one's a musical and that are so fun and playful and so much lighter. And I was like, yeah, I need a cathartic purge in the form of a horror movie. And then we can go to the next ones and have fun.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I feel like the piece about just needing to write something or just needing to get something out and get that energy out of our body. I journal a lot as well. And some people journal and they reread their journals. And I nope.
Oh, I didn't either.
Nope. I'm like, it wasn't fun when I was writing it. And it's not going to be fun to reread it. So, but again, it works however it works. Everybody's a little bit different about that. But I think, again, that piece of sometimes we just have to get it on a sheet of paper or get it out of our system. And sometimes we can do that in a creative way. And sometimes we can do that in a way that's just for ourselves that still can feel creative. And I think that figuring out what an amazing thing to aspire to in terms of, directing this movie, your first, I'm sure it's not the first film you've directed? No, of course not.
It's the first a feature is a film that's like 90 to 120 minutes. So it's my first like full length movie that I can like sell and go nationally with. But I've made shorts and all that fun stuff in the past.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I figured. So knowing that you're already trying to be so aware of that, I think is so great. And just and I feel like another way to show an industry that sometimes otherwise makes it seem like you have to starve yourself or you have to be this method person who like acts like Abraham Lincoln for, 6 months, which is like, nobody wants to do that.
Make everyone call you Mr. President.
Does. Daniel Day-Lewis does.
Well, exactly.
He wants people to call him Mr. President. So,
Yeah. So, but I mean, but that piece of that idea that it has to be painful in order for it to be worth it is such a silly, unnecessary thought and feeling. And it even makes me think about how different of a portrayal of a character are you getting from an actor who doesn't feel drained at the end of every day, who can be like, I feel okay. And I can put that in its box and I'm going to go home and be myself. And how different even just that piece, that shift of that. And even when I feel like when you hear actors talk about what it was like with a certain director, or if you don't hear what they think of a certain director, which I feel like speaks volumes versus people who can talk about it. But the way that some of the actors talk about how their directors were with them, and what an experience it was, and how different it felt, and how it felt different than any other film that they had done. It's like, exactly, because it doesn't have to be where everybody is freezing and getting screamed at. Like it can be so different. And that idea that that's the only way you can get, what do they say? You can get it out of a person, or I can't fucking remember the word I'm trying to think of, but so that's just on this side of it. It's just really exciting to hear that someone is actually paying attention to that, because sometimes it doesn't feel that way in terms of what we hear or what it sounds like sometimes actors are describing.
Yeah, there is sometimes that energy on set where you're like, because, we work 12 hours a day for a month straight on set, prepping, going lightning speed. And everyone's like, it's the end of the world. There's nothing more important. And you're like, yes, films can change a lot and bring a lot to us. And at the end of the day, it's just a movie. And we're all humans. And so I also work in set design, and I worked with a production designer. She's like, this is really indie. We're going to be working a lot. And she's like, at the end of the day, even if I text you, don't look at your phone. She's like, it's not worth it. At the end of the day, she's like, I just need to throw that out there. No one's going to say that because they'll act like it's the end of the world, but it's not worth it. And I'm like, it's not. We need to protect ourselves. We need to be there for each other. And we need to also wake up in a couple of days and still feel good about the work we just did. And I want to do this my whole life. And so I don't want to then burn out and feel like I'm bleeding myself out for the art. I'm like, no, I want the film that I write and then I call my best friend about, and I'm like, I'm really excited about this idea. It feels so good. And it was a cathartic purge, but it was awesome. And there was a sheet and it was flowing and I loved it. And then she's like, sick, let me read it.
Well, because it's like you said, it doesn't have to be all of the juice of it, all of the the full heart of it for people to see it. Because for anyone who listens to our podcast, we talk about some of the most random movies that you wouldn't think you would think of psychologically. And if you're looking for that, and if you need that, and if you see yourself in something, you'll find it, even if it's an action movie or a fantasy movie. You don't have to tear all your insides out and be so literal for people to find value in it. And so it is something to be mindful about when creating art. Is it doesn't have to be all of the hard bits. People will still get what they need out of it.
And for me, I as a movie watcher, I have the bad habit of rewatching movies over and over again. And so I also want to make a movie that you want to rewatch, that you still feel good point. Afterwards.
That's a great point.
You're speaking Hannah's language right now.
Yeah. My rating scale of a movie is is it good like artistically, and is it good like I would want to rewatch it? I'm like, oh, it's a good movie artistically, and I want to rewatch it. I'm like, okay, those are my top 10. Otherwise, I'm like The Revenant. I'm like, it looked cool.
Yeah, I couldn't finish that one. I was like, this just.
It was fine.
Yeah,
it was fine.
The acting was great, but like, I don't know. It's not enjoyable to watch.
Well, I would say a good
Tom
example.
Hardy was being a maniac. Yeah. That's what it was.
Well, that's how he do. No, but I think a good example, which is actually what we're about to do for this podcast, and is Moonlight for me. Like, beautiful movie, important movie. I'm gonna revisit it for the second time for the podcast, but it like destroyed me probably more than any movie has, just because it was so good. But I was like, I can't. This isn't something I can revisit, because I can't be sobbing like for a day straight once a month.
And that's where it's like those stories are so important to tell, and they need to be out there. And I think, at least where I'm at in my life right now, what I'm ready to tell are stories that have nuggets of those but are rewatchable. And I will leave those stories to the people who need to tell them and feel so driven. And maybe one day I'll get hit and like, that's my drive. I'm like, I need to tell this exact story, and it's hard, and you might not want to rewatch it, and that's where I'm at. So like, I'm like, please make Moonlight, please make those messages out. And that's not sleep talking.
Hannah loves to watch a movie that over and over again that is a gut wrencher. Her gut wrenchers and her entertainer movies are a one circle.
Yeah, it's kind of messy. It's gotten a little bit better in the last couple of years, but I really just would watch something really horrible that was really upsetting in a lot of different ways, repeatedly, probably more to punish myself than anything else. But just the idea of being able to tell a story that doesn't have to be to an extreme that makes everything cringy or everything so hard that you don't care what's happening to the characters anymore, because you're having so many feelings yourself that it's hard to even consider that piece.
Definitely. Like it's Penny Marshall. She did Big, and she did A League of Their Own. She honestly was just like, I want little nuggets where you feel something, and that where you really connect to it. And I was reading her book, and I was like, honestly, yeah, that just really resonated, where I want to feel something natural. I want to pull from my life, and let's all enjoy it together in a theater or a drive-in.
Right. Like, and when you watch A League of Your Own or A League of Their Own, it's all like that fun and kind of light. And then there's a few moments that they just sneak in there. They go like, and right in the feels. Like when the one woman gets the news that her husband died in the war, everything's so happy, and they just go, bam, and there's life.
Mm-hmm. You're just like, oh, so good, you hurt me. And then we all sing a song later, and I'm like, okay, good.
Okay, we can feel good again, but we access the emotion, but then we can feel good again.
But I mean, that is a movie that I would watch with my siblings. And I love that movie. And I probably watched that movie maybe a year or something, or 2 years, but that's a movie that I always will watch, because even though it has some of those hard pieces, it's also the reality of that time. I mean, they literally were playing baseball while their husbands were overseas fighting in a war. Yeah. So talk about, and Big, one of those movies that whenever it's on TV, whenever it's on anywhere, I'll sit down and watch it, because has those really perfect pieces of being that age and being stuck in an adult body and really not wanting to be one.
Yeah. And I always think of, like, with kind of on the topic of those movies that like punch you in the gut, or media that punches you in the gut and then goes right back. Like, I always think of Hamilton, where it's like after Angelica Schuyler's like cheated on, she finds out, or not Angelica, his wife, Eliza, my brain. Hamilton's wife. But it's like
I've
they
only watched
sing
it
Burn.
once.
It's okay. And they're like, they sob, and they're like, can we get back to politics, please? And I'm like, yeah, let's pivot.
is there anything more we want to talk about with? I know we're going to keep talking together about kind of the process as it proceeds, but is there anything else kind of about the stage that you're at or have been in that you'd want to speak to in terms of the psychology of it or what it was like for you?
I think the only other part I'm thinking of is like, as a writer, for me, I'm not always aware about this. Like when I'm writing a script, I'm not like, oh, I'm going to like conquer this psychological thing and then I'm going to really dive into it. A lot of it is I start writing it and I start playing with an image and I start having fun with it. And then I'm like, okay, what do we see here? How do I connect to this character that's not really shaped yet? And then like, I always say like writing a script is like getting a ball of clay and you're like, huh, that kind of looks like a horse. And then you start just like refining the details and you're like, okay, now it's this kind of horse. And this is the horse's life story. And we'll tell you more about a horse. I know very little about horses, but my brain always goes to a horse with that metaphor.
No, I think it's a good point because I would imagine if you go about it the opposite direction, it might be hard to make it organic.
Definitely. And sometimes like I'm a big revision script writer. Like I wrote the first draft of this over a year ago, last April. And then I didn't feel like I had a finished draft. Like I had 120 pages actually, and now it's down to 89. But I didn't feel like I had a full thing until maybe October, November. Because like also a horror film, because it's a mystery plot at the same time, you have to make sure the dominoes all line up perfectly. Otherwise you're like, oh, I got that information too early. I actually know what's going on. And you're like, I still have no idea what's going on and everyone's dead. No spoilers. We'll find out. But
Yeah.
Which way is just going this time?
And so, but yeah, it's a lot of just like play and going back and forth and just trying to understand what the script is half the time until you're like, okay, I finally understand where this is going. Now let me like really pull out this piece and be like, actually, this part doesn't work anymore. And that's where you hear the term "kill your darlings."
Yeah.
You rewrite.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I'm excited to keep talking about this movie, Sleep Talking. Would you want to shout out any of the places where people can find you through this process or where they could even like donate to this, in the fundraising efforts?
Yeah, definitely. So we are, as you said, we're in our fundraising process. We are actually raising $50,000 on Seed and Spark right now. And it's actually at our bit.ly, so bit.ly/sleeptalkingfilm. And we are currently, we're recording in real life time. We are already 20% of the way through and we're on our third day. So we're ticking forward. So you can find our promo video on there. You can find us on Instagram at Sleep Talking Film. You can find us on Twitter at Sleep Talking Flm, FLM, because character count. And you can also follow my account, Jess Costa Films, on Instagram as well. And our website is sleeptalking.film because branding.
And we will make sure, if you check out our Instagram, we'll make sure to post places where you can also find some of these resources. You can find us at Popcorn Psychology on Instagram and Facebook. You can find us on Twitter at popcorn_psych. And you can email us at popcornpsychology@gmail.com if you want to send us lovely messages. And I guess constructive ones if you feel like it, but we would really like lovely ones. And you guys do. We read all the messages you send us and we share them with each other. You can also leave us any reviews if you feel so appreciative to do so at Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen. And yeah, we look forward to continuing this series together.
I'm so excited. Thank you all for having me on, and I'm excited to bring you all on this journey.
Yeah, thank you for thinking of us.
Well, we're excited. This is really fun. Thanks for coming.
Thanks.